Hey folks, Mr. Olson here. Let's do some econ. This is micro, topic 6.5 on inequality. And inequality and unfair distribution of wealth and income is our fourth and final market failure. And if we're going to advocate for free markets and the great job they do overall at distributing resources, we're going to have to reconcile that with inequality in our society today. So how do we end up in a society where we have rampant homelessness? At the same time, we have billionaires like Oprah worth 2.6 billion, and then of course Bezos, Musk, Gates worth well over 100 billion now. In early 2021, Musk overtook Bezos to become the world's richest person. So clearly there's some failure at the system if we get this level of massive wealth inequality. And of course, wealth inequality has a racial dynamic as well. Income is the amount of money or other income flows coming to a person every year, and wealth or net worth is the total amount of assets that someone has. So let's just talk a little bit about wealth on the right-hand side a little bit here. We can just look at medium wealth net worth. For white Americans is about 171,000, and for Black Americans is about 17,000. So white families have a median net worth that is about 10 times greater than Black households. And in many ways, over the last 50 years, there's been a lot of progress for African Americans, our society, but that wealth gap has stayed constant over the last few decades. And there's a lot of causes for that. We can talk a little bit about them. One reason that comes to mind is redlining, which discriminated against housing and mortgages for African Americans historically. And because if you're in the middle class, one of the main ways that you build wealth is based on your home value and its appreciation. So for middle class families, about 2/3 of their wealth is usually in the form of their home. And because African Americans did not get access to mortgages historically, their families weren't able to build wealth in housing. So that's one example of a cause of this. And there are, of course, many others. So there's some amazing data out there now. This comes from Raj Chetty at Harvard, and he looks at upward mobility by race. So we're going to look at today different income groups and how we measure that. And these maps show income rank for boys with parents earning $25,000. So if your parents earn $25,000 in the US, what are your earnings going to be in your lifetime? Part of the American dream is that your kids do better than you, and each generation gets wealthier and wealthier. However, there's a dynamic difference based on race for that in the US. So these are the incomes of African American males on the left-hand side, and you can see that many of them on average earn less than their parents did, whereas for white men, they're more likely to earn more than their parents did. So you kind of see a divergence here of opportunity. And a lot of this is coming out from big data and census data that is used by Raj Chetty at Harvard. So pretty interesting stuff there. So lots of good research and hopefully policy coming in this decade as a result of stuff like that. The good news is that in the US, poverty is falling. So poverty has fallen over the previous decades for everybody, and poverty across the world and in the US is lower than it ever has been. However, that has a racial dynamic as well. And you can see that African American poverty and Hispanic poverty rates are higher than white or Asian Americans. So just a couple of things to think about and kind of put this in a broader context. To zoom in a little bit more to what we're focusing on today, we're going to look about how do we measure income inequality as economists, and how do we use that to compare countries over time and compare the impacts of different policies like progressive taxation. So according to the IMF in 2020, average American per person income was about $63,000. And if you make $63,000 a year, everyone's obviously pretty rich, right? Well, no, of course, we can't use the average to analyze what life is like for 330 million Americans. $63,000, first of all, goes a lot farther in some rural parts of the country compared to, say, the San Francisco Bay Area. And of course, this is not taking into account how that income is distributed. That is just showing the average income per person. So what governments do and economists do is measure the distribution of income to give us some more information about how those incomes are distributed each year. Okay? And the way that we're going to do that is with something called the Lorenz curve. I'm going to teach you what the Lorenz curve is and how we derive the Gini coefficient from it. You will never need to draw the Lorenz curve. You will never need to calculate the Gini coefficient in this class, but I want to show you where these are coming from because you do need to interpret Lorenz curve graphs and interpret Gini coefficient numbers in terms of what they mean. So here's how the Lorenz curve works. What you do is you take all income earning families and you divide them into 5 groups, 5 quintiles. Okay, so it's the richest 20%, the next 20%, the middle 20%, the next 20%, and then the poorest, right? And the poorest 20%. So you divide the income groups into 5 equal groups. And if there are perfect equality in a society, then 20% of families would earn 20% of the income, and so on and so forth. And what we're able to do with the Lorenz curve is compare how the actual distribution of income compares to that kind of perfect distribution point. And so what does that actually look like in the US? So the poorest 20%, this is older data, but the reason I'm showing you this is because that's what's plotted on these slides. So in reality, in the early 2000s, the poorest 20% of Americans had about 5% of the total income. That next quintile had about 10, the middle group 15, the next group 25, and then the richest 20% of Americans had about 45% of the total income. That's higher now because a lot of the trends that have caused inequality in the US have accelerated in the last 15 years or so. But these are the points that we're going to plot. So in 2003, this is how that income was distributed across those 5 groups. So here's how we draw the Lorenz curve. On the vertical axis, we put the percentage of income, and in the horizontal, we put the percentage of households. And this line across the middle would represent perfect equality. No one in 2021 is advocating that there should be perfect equality. That was the goal of perfect equality was communism, which was a 20th century experiment that largely failed. So no one's advocating necessarily for perfect equality because you want to attract different people to different industries so we can have more efficient markets. But we certainly don't want too much inequality either. So what we can do with our Lorenz curve is we're going to plot out how do those numbers I showed you on the last slide actually compare to perfect equality? Well, the bottom quintile has 5% of the wealth, so you would plot a point there. And then that next 40% had 15, and so on and so forth. So what you can see is the Lorenz curve, which shows the actual distribution of wealth. And it bows out because of the inequality that exists in society. It's always going to start in the bottom left and finish in the top right because 0% of families must have 0% of the wealth and 100% of families must have 100% of the wealth. Sometimes this is known as the banana curve because it kind of bows out and looks like a banana, okay? And the more that that curve bows out, then the higher the inequality that there is. So given this Lorenz curve graph, we can derive the Gini coefficient from it. And what you do to get the Gini coefficient is you take the area of A and you divide it by the sum of areas A and B. And if there was perfect equality, then A would be 0, right? So you would have a Gini coefficient of 0. And if there's perfect inequality, which is a society where one family had all the wealth, then your Gini coefficient would be 1 because A and B would be equal, or excuse me, A would be equal to the sum of A and B, right? So the Gini coefficient spits out a number between 0 and 1. The higher the number, which the number, in other words, the closer it is to 1, the more inequality, because this curve would be bowed out more. And the closer it is to 0, the less inequality, as represented by the curve being closer to that perfect inequality line. So that's where the Gini coefficient comes from. Again, you don't need to calculate that, but I wanted you to understand where that comes from. One of the ways that this is used is to look at different policies about redistributing income. Okay, so in the US, we'll talk about that in a second, we have a progressive tax system and we have a social safety net, and that's going to redistribute some wealth. And you can look at the impact of those policies by seeing how much they bow in the curve, right? So government transfer payments, like welfare payments and other programs, are going to shift the Lorenz curve inward and more towards equality. And something that you should definitely be thinking about is what are the pros and cons of that? What are the benefits of redistributing wealth across society, and what are the costs of doing so? Because remember, in economics, we generally say there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs, right? And what you need to do as a citizen and as an economist and a member of our society is kind of weigh those pros and cons, think about how much redistribution you would advocate for. Here is a chart showing some Gini coefficients for comparison. This is from an awesome site called All Our World in Data. And what you see here is in red, the Gini coefficient that exists in these different countries. And then also the Gini coefficient that shows the disposable income, in other words, after progressive taxation and after transfers. So you can see the US for a Western industrialized country is relatively unequal. So our Gini coefficient before redistribution is about 0.51, and after redistribution, it's about 0.39. So we're up here kind of closer to some Latin American countries where there is the region in the world with the highest income inequality is Latin America. So the US is a little bit closer up there. And then you can compare some Scandinavian countries and other Western European countries have higher levels of equality. And one of the reasons is they have bigger welfare states and more generous redistribution and higher taxes paid by top income earners, right? So just to take Austria as an example, their Gini coefficient before redistribution is almost exactly the same as the US. However, they have more progressive taxation system, more generous redistribution for the poor, and higher tax rates on those rich folks, which is going to make them more equal in the end. So kind of a fun international comparison there. These are the most unequal countries in the world based on the Gini coefficient. And so you can see that South Africa has the highest Gini coefficient in the world. You get a comparison here. So now we looked at the Gini coefficient to analyze why we have inequality in the US and what are some different reasons for that. One reason is different tax structures, which we're going to talk about in today's lesson. Progressive and regressive tax structures can contribute to wealth and income inequality. Differences in human capital and social capital and inheritance can contribute to wealth and income inequality. So human capital are the skills and experience that you have that are going to earn you higher wages, right? So across our society, because of unequal access to education, we have huge differences in human capital. And that's going to mean that the wages that folks earn in those labor markets is going to be drastically different, which is going to contribute to income inequality. Social capital means how much access you have to privileges and opportunities in your society. And we have, based on discrimination and other things, big differences there. And then inheritance is a big issue, like I alluded to when we talked about the racial wealth gap a few minutes ago. Discrimination contributes to inequality in our society. Access to financial markets. So over the last 30 years, Citigroup did a study that estimated that like the US economy would be, could have discrimination by banks against African Americans cost the US economy $5 trillion of growth. In other words, and there's a bunch of studies that go out there and prove it, African Americans are less likely to get access to home loans, car loans, and business loans. And the business loans piece is huge. And if there would have been equality in financial markets, then that would have contributed to more economic growth. And that also contributes to the inequality issues that are out there. And then differences in mobility, like I talked about with that Raj Chetty slide at the beginning, also contribute to wealth and income inequality. Okay. And then different access to economic and social units, right? So Depending on the quality of the company that you work for, you're going to have different amounts of bargaining power. Labor unions can contribute to this, and different family arrangements and stability in family arrangements contribute to this as well. Labor unions have declined over the last 30 years in the US, so the percentage of workers in labor unions has gone way down. And so that bargaining power for workers has gone down with it. Public sector unions are still strong. And that's one of the reasons that teachers and public employees have a lot of times better benefits than folks in the private sector. But there are trade-offs there as well, because state and local governments struggle financially because they have big retirement burdens for retired employees. So anyway, a few kind of formal reasons why those inequalities exist. What we're going to look at for the final part of this lesson is types of taxes, because progressive tax systems are one of the strongest tools to address income inequality in societies. So as you know, taxes are mandatory payments made to the government to cover the cost of governing, okay? And we talked about the free rider problem earlier in this unit. And one of the ways to deal with the free rider problem is to create a forced rider problem, which is to make everyone pay, right? And so you don't have to worry about free riders if you collect taxes from everyone, right? This is also the way that public goods are going to also need to be provided by the government. Yeah, so why does the government do that? Well, they want to finance government operations, like I already said, to provide public goods, to support production in industries where there's lots of positive externalities, and to fund programs like Social Security and welfare. And the government also taxes, though, in addition to this funding operations, the government's also going to tax to influence the behavior of firms and individuals. And we already talked about that when we were looking at negative externalities. So you can put an excise tax on tobacco to raise revenue and discourage the use of cigarettes. There's been a bunch of other interesting examples the last decade with soda taxes in New York City. Some European countries even taxed like desserts and pastries with high fat content to try to discourage their consumption over the last decade. So lots of attempts to use tax to individual behaviors. The carbon tax is a really great example of this too, to try to limit carbon production. So when we categorize the types of taxes, there are 3 types of taxes. And this is important, and this trips up students sometimes, so pay attention right here. The types of taxes are categorized based on the percentage of income they take from you. So a progressive tax takes a larger percent of income from high income groups. In other words, they take a larger percent of the income from rich folks. Okay. The current federal income tax system in the US is progressive, because if you earn more money, you pay a higher percentage of that income to the government. And if you earn less money, you pay a lower percentage of that income. The second category of tax is a proportional tax or a flat rate tax, and that's going to take the same percentage of income from all income groups. For example, if there was a flat tax of 20%, all income groups, regardless of how much money you've earned, would pay 20% to the government. Some Republican politicians have advocated for that over the last few decades in terms of advocating for a flat tax where everyone pays the same percentage. Okay. And the third category is a regressive tax system. Regressive taxes take a larger percentage from low income groups. Okay, and they take more for the poor people. This sounds draconian, obviously, but regressive taxes are actually more common than you'd think. Any sales tax is regressive because when you look at it as a percentage of income, it affects the poor more than it does the rich. And that's one of the reasons that a lot of times groceries, for example, and medicine are exempt from sales tax, because they would be such a high percentage of income for poor families who are purchasing them. So those are the 3 categories. Let's see if you're getting it. I want you to pause the video. I want you to look at these 5 examples and tell me, are they progressive, regressive, or proportional? And remember, the key is think about percentage of income. All right, number 1 is regressive. Number 2 is progressive. Number 3 is regressive. Number 4 is proportional. And number 5 is regressive. And as a percentage of income, that sales tax that we have in California is regressive because as a percentage of income, it takes more from the poor than it does from the rich. Just to show you the most up-to-date tax brackets in the US, you can see that if you earn up to, let's just look at a single individual. So for those of you who have jobs out there, if you earn up to $9,875 in 2020, you'll pay 10% of that income to the government. And then each range of earnings here give higher and higher percentages. So the current highest tax bracket is 37%. So for each dollar that you earn over $518,000, 37% of that goes to Uncle Sam. Okay. Now, common misperception: students assume that if you earn $518,000, 37% of all of that goes to the government. That's not the case, right? So for no matter how much you earn, so even if you earn $600,000 a year, for the first $9,800 you earned, 10% of that goes to the government, and then for that for the next $30K or so, between $9,800 and $40,000, 12% of it goes, and so on and so forth. So it's not actually 30%, 7% of your total income. It's only 37% of income above $518,000. Okay, so it's a common misperception. Students think that you wouldn't want to go to the next bracket because you're going to get taxed more. That's not necessarily the case. Hopefully that makes sense. And something for you to think about as a citizen, as an economist, as a member of our society is that current system fair, right? Generally speaking, Republican politicians have advocated for lower tax brackets over the years, and Democrats have called for higher ones. That's a simplification that's generally true. But when we're looking at the market failure of income inequality, there's a consensus amongst economists that the progressive tax system is the most effective way to fight that market failure. So the most direct way you can impact income inequality is by having a progressive tax system and then using that revenue to improve education and services and opportunities for lower income groups. There are no solutions, there are only trade-offs, right? And by taxing more, you're creating more deadweight loss in otherwise efficient markets, right? You guys understand that now. However, if you want to deal with inequality, this is one of the most effective ways to do them. Drum roll, please. I have an announcement. You are now officially done with microeconomics, and you know everything there is to know about AP microeconomics, and you know as much about microeconomics as a freshman in college. So congratulations, enjoy the